Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Ludwig, the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum, and I'm happy to be welcoming you back to the fourth part of our examination of Mr. Seward's 1870 and 1871 trip all the way around the world. It's April, well April's ending, it's almost May. We're going to look back at where Mr. Seward was this time 150 years ago. He spent much of that month in India. We left you in Putiala. Now, Seward spends a lot of time in India. This is a 15-month journey. He's in India for a long time. Part of that is because he's sightseeing. Another part of it is because he gets very, very ill. So I'm going to pick up from about the halfway point of Seward's time in India. He started here around Calcutta. He's worked his way inland. And about the point where we're beginning, on April 1st, 1871, he's traveled almost 1,200 miles deep into the interior of northern India. A note about this is that Seward is impressed. His travels are made easier, and he writes about this in his eventual travels memoir, William H. Seward Travels Around the World. The advancements made by infrastructure, railroads, canals, roads, and bridges. He is not doing this slowly. He's taking the railroads. A lot of Seward's trip finds him sticking to the coast where boats can get him safely, but in India, occupied by British colonial rule, he's able to very safely and easily travel great distances overland. This is a really unique opportunity for Seward. Unlike any other part of his trip, he goes deep into the interior of the country where he's exploring. Mr. Seward also finds India's climate to be inhospitable. He is, as he writes, always wearing his trademark Panama hat to keep the sun out of his eyes. He will come very close to adopting nocturnalism at parts of the hottest weather times on his travels. And throughout his April 1871 time in India, he is constantly being warned and told, especially by British officials, the hot weather season is coming and Seward does not want to linger in India any later than mid-late April, or the climate will overwhelm him. They speak of an intensity of heat that Seward's never known, and he's older, he's 70. And he's not a well man. There are times he has to be carried and assisted when he's going on foot. So he begins to hurry up, and these railway lines make that possible. Let's begin then on April 1st. Mr. Seward wakes up in Putiala. He's been there for about a day. He describes his accommodations as a small palace. This was not uncommon that great homes would be opened up for Seward during his stay. He spends a few days in Putiala where he is hosted by the Maharaja of this state of India. He is invited to visit his menagerie. He sees tigers. He sees what he calls wild beasts. And I'm going to read this one, make sure I get the word correct. A really interesting thing, Seward was very curious to see the cassowaries, these large birds on these grounds. And while he's free to roam and explore, he's also a guest. And the Maharaja invites him to a special durbar, or basically an appointment or a reception at his court in his 4-story palace. Seward accepts that invitation. So on April 1st, he has one of the biggest, wildest days of his time. It begins with a day-long series of events, beginning with these animals. He then goes to an elephant fighting ring, a ghastly scene. This is followed by acrobats, jugglers, performances, great musical numbers, eventually a large pyrotechnic, that's Seward's word, fireworks show, floating lanterns. And he goes from basically the city to the Maharaja's palace on a special ride, howdah, or on the back of an elephant. He's being driven around. He describes what it's like, and we'll have an image of the howdah to show you. Seward actually rides this elephant from the city to the palace. At the palace, he's hosted for an evening reception and meal. He meets the Maharaja's family, a young prince, his wives. He's able to have a speech with him. He's greeted as an honored guest and says it's his pleasure to be there. Here's how he writes about, in the travels book, what it was like to see the inside of this 4-story palace. Having arrived there by elephant, arriving at the palace around 8 o'clock. All 2,000 candles were ablaze and were reflected to infinitude by the broad, bright mirrors, not only the salon, but the court, the grand stairway, the portico. The entire palace with its 1,000 windows and balconies were illuminated. So the ancestral hall of Putiala was as brilliant as the mountain palace in which Cupid, visited the enchanted Psyche. He lingers a few days in Puttahala, and then he continues to go even further north. You can see here, Kusavali, as it was called, it was a British outpost, soldiers right on the slopes of the Himalayas. He's taking a train car about 70 miles north to get to here, one of the northernmost stops of his trip here in the subcontinent. And he spends a few days. This was a big excursion for Seward. What he hopes to do is to see and maybe even summit some of the more modestly sized Himalayan mountains. So he arrives on April 6th, and he spends about 3 days. Now, you can't get train up the Himalayas, right? So when he arrives on April 6th, he has to disembark. And I mentioned Seward's not a well man. He is carried in what he calls a sedan chair, 9 miles to the basemost, smallest of the Himalayan mountains. And I want to read for you what it was like for Seward to see from just the foothills, the grand scene spread out before him. You can almost hear the wistfulness. He wishes he was perhaps well enough to hike and go deeper, climb higher. But alas, he is not, but he settles for a spectacular vista. Often we descended by a long-hewn road from the mountainside into shaded dells and crossed noisy brooks. This is him on the chair. Only to rise by a similar acclivity to higher hilltops. The Himalayas confronted us, stretching east and west as far as the eyes could reach, looming halfway up to the center of the heavens. The crest was an undulating field of dazzling snow, but presto, change! Even at the moment when we were aiming the telescope, black spots descended on that white mantle. The clouds came back again. Thenceforth, neither rocks nor snowfields were to be seen. The distant Himalayas disappeared as suddenly as they had come before us. He saw the big ones. Nevertheless, we were content. We stood on the giant's foot, and for one moment, we looked him fully in the face. Now, from this point on, Seward really picks up the pace on his trip. April 6th finds him going to Kusavali, and now he starts booking it. He's being warned again and again, get out of India before summer, and summer will start early. So he starts flying. By April 8th, he's in Jaipur, right here, Lucknow, and then he cuts Lucknow first, then Jaipur, and then all the way to Bombay. So he goes vroom, vroom, vroom in about a week. He calls the railroad carrying there his cozy railway home. He lives in the railway car for the better part of a week, arriving in Bombay, or modern-day Mumbai, on April 13th. He spends a week here. The weather isn't so bad, it seems. He's preparing for an ocean voyage across the sea to get himself to the Middle East. And while he's making preparations, as he calls it, leave-taking, he spends one final week in India. He does some sightseeing and also acts on some official business. The sightseeing first. We're going to show you an image from Elephanta Island, which is just off the coast of modern-day Mumbai or Bombay. And there were spectacular caves, caverns, and underground temples that Seward visits. So on April 14th, 1861, he visits, and you're going to see this image as I read it to you, and then the words of this passage from his book, this magnificent underground temple. Passing to the center of the plateau and turning right on Elephanta Island, we confronted a work of human art, gigantic and marvelous. It is a subterranean temple. The builders, beginning halfway up the mountain declivity and cutting down perpendicularly, have removed the mountain face to the depth of 30 feet and to the width of 300 feet. This rock they have hewn and chiseled away to the very center of the mountain and wrought into it a temple with perfect architectural forms and just proportions. The excavation consists of 4 chambers. The central one is majestic, with gateways, abutments, porches, columns, pilasters, cornices, and vaulted ceilings as complete and perfect as if, instead of having been carved in the rock, they had been detached from it, framed, and erected on the ground. While no architectural element is omitted, all are perfectly finished. So some sightseeing, typical holiday stuff. Seward's being presented with a lot of gifts at this time, coins and silks. One of the collection objects that we'll show you is a beautiful and intricate lighter that he brings home from India. And when he's in what he calls Bombay, he's saying goodbye. He's actually hosted by the British government, and the Viceroy of India, the leader of the British government, was Lord Mayo. And Seward is profuse in his thanks of Mayo for hosting him. Mayo hosts him actually in person, and sees to it that everywhere Seward goes, he's protected, he's safe. The British Army is essentially guaranteeing Seward's comfort and safety as much as they can, and so he wants to give great thanks here. And he's actually quite sad. In the travels book, he writes that not long after Seward departs, Mayo is assassinated by a prisoner, and one of his old friends, Lord Napier, who he knows quite well from his time as Lincoln's Secretary of State negotiating with the British during the Civil War, replaces Mayo as Viceroy. So one of Seward's old contacts becomes Viceroy. During this time, while he's being very gracious, he's not uncritical. On April 21st, 1871, he's invited to give a speech to a club, and he assesses the state of British colonial rule in India. He says there's some to be admired. He's trying to be nice to his host. He applauds the building of railroad lines and schools, but he does not approve of what the British have done, which is to conquer and occupy a people. And he speaks to Lord Mayo and his men. Lord Mayo famously says, the sun will never set on the British Empire and India will be held forever. That he looks forward to the day, and soon, when the British Army leaves. Seward's own preferred style of expansion is to let free markets and democracy rule. That would be the style he would prefer to see. A sort of open door diplomacy that would be in the offing pretty soon in American foreign policy. So he's got sort of a mixed message, like, you're doing some good here, but occupying this place and the people, that's a problem. On April 22nd, he takes his leave from Bombay and begins a long journey across the sea. I'm going to read you a quote from that journey in just a moment, but let me make sure I've got my facts straight here. In the days that followed, as Seward writes, once more at sea, he takes for himself the largest steamer in the peninsular and oriental line, where he sits on the deck for about a week, watching the skipping flying fish around the bow of the ship, talking to fellow passengers, beginning some early writing, until finally, on April 28th, they arrive in the Middle East. And Seward knows he's just left a distinct part of the world behind with a new part to explore and see. And so he writes at the close of this section of his book, looking forward to May 1871 and new explorations, what this change means. We realize here that we've reached a new stage of our round-the-world voyage. We are leaving, rather, let us say, we have left the far east and the south behind us. Though not yet arrived at the west and the north, we are on their confines. So next we'll see Seward going up into Egypt, the Middle East, and Europe. All of that still is to come on future months of our retrospective, the sesquicentennial of Mr. Seward's trip around the world. We hope you'll join us next month. If you have any questions about this part of Seward's journey, about the travels book in general, please leave them in the comment sections, and myself or other staff will answer them. And come visit us, learn more about this trip.